Hello friends, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to discuss about few tips and tricks for Ruby on Rails developers, and by using these tips and tricks, you can write clean and efficient code in your Rails application which will lead the high performance or application and which will make a better Rails application with standard practices. So let's start with the first tip. The first tip is avoid n plus 1 queries into your Rails application. You should never write queries which will cause n plus 1 problem while accessing any page or while performing any queries. This will result in very slow performance when you try to load the model instances from the database, and it will slow down your performance. The next tip is use find is for loading model instances. For example, if you have an article model and you want to load all the instances of that article model into the database, from the database to your web page, then you should not use article.all. Instead, you must use article.find underscore each. Why? Because find each does not load all the article instances at once. Instead, it will load all the article instances into batches. By default, it will be 1000, and if you want, you can define the size of batches. But find each will not load all the article instances at once. And why? That dot all method is bad because it will never cause any problem in the development, but it will cause the problem when you are in production mode or when your application is live. So in that case, that will definitely slow down your performance if there are so many records. So you must use find is because that will perform loading instances into batches. The third tip, write thin controllers. Your controller should not be very fatty. You should manipulate your business logic from model to view via controllers, but your controller should have as thin as possible. Okay, so you should not write very large methods into your controllers, or you should not write very large controller files, or should not put too many methods inside the controller. Only put necessary routes, and if possible try to refactor that which routes are preferable for that controller, and use helper classes or active support concerns for making that controller very thin or efficient. Okay. The fourth tips, use gems only when needed, because gems are the libraries and always considered as the separate smaller Ruby application as well. For example, if you know about the device, then device is mainly used for the authentication purpose, but device is a gem, and when you load it into Rails application, it will load an smaller Ruby application into your project or into your Rails application. So you should use gems only when needed, for because there are so many gems which serve the very small purposes as well. So you should write your functions or method classes there with instead of using gems, because gems are for making your programming task very easier and to provide you the and flexibility of using the already available features and increase your productivity. But too many gems will cause performance of your application very slow. Okay, so avoid using unnecessary gems which are not required. Okay, and if possible that to write that feature in minimal time, then you should write that feature instead of using gems. But yeah, still gems provide the way to develop application in very faster way. So you can use gems, but try to avoid unnecessary loading unnecessary gems into your applications, because that will lead your application performing high. The fifth tips, write scopes and avoid writing complex query in controller. For example, uh, you have an index section where you need to display all the articles which are published before 2020. Okay, now what you will do that you have a option to write that query into your controller action, but you should not do that. Instead, you must write or you must implement a scoped query into your article model, which will fetch all the articles which are published before year 2020, and then you just need to call that model scope into your controller, and that will fetch the data from the database or will load all the respective model instances from the database. So when you write scope into your model and avoid writing those complex query in your controller, that is a good practice, and it will also lead or also encourage you to write thin controllers. The sixth tip: avoid calling mailer from the controller action. For example, there is a procedure like there is a feature that is required, like whenever a user sign up to your system, you need to send a confirmation email to that particular user, or after some certain action you need to send email to the collection of users, or you need to send any kind of email to on any kind of activity. Then what the simplest approach is that call the mailer inside the controller action itself. For example, whenever a user gets created, just send an email to that user. But this is not a good practice. For example, if you have only one mailer in your application and that is responsible for sending one email after every user gets created, then it is okay to call that from controller action. But for example, but if your application using too much mailers and so many activities are there which require sending email from your Rails application to outside users, then you must use either active jobs or worker classes. So mailer should be sent from the background jobs, not from your controller action. That will make your controller action very efficient and faster, because if you send email from the background job, your controller action will render the data successfully, and the mailing service or mailer service is running inside the background, and that will send the email. Okay, and it will result in a faster rendering of the from the controller action. So always remember that avoid calling mailer from the controller action. The next tip is handle basic exception and display meaningful messages if there are errors. Why this tips is required and why this tip is very necessary? Because for example, you have a form where some user has to come and submit their data, and what happen if they submit the empty form and nothing is displayed to them? They will be confused as whether this form is valid or not, or which attributes they have to insert and which they there are optional. So you always write some validation rules to display the errors, like name should be present, email should be present, or this field is optional, or that field is required. So these are the practices we follow while writing validation. Some such as, for example, if user try to access a record from the URL which is not exist in the database. For example, user try to find a user with ID 100. Okay, but user with ID 100 is not exist in your database, then it will result in 404 error, or it will display that the record does not found. But that does not make sense to display that technical error to the user. Instead, you must write a meaningful message that the record you are trying to access does not exist in our database, or 404 page, or some meaningful message that will make sense to the user that okay, so user is trying something else. Or if there is any 505 500 error, like if something is breaking internally, then rather than showing error page, sorry, default error page, you must tell them that something might be wrong there, or they are performing some wrong operations, that's why this error has been causes. So that will make a better impression on the end user while when user sees these kind of error messages. So these basic exception handling and displaying meaningful error messages to the user make very good sense and can be considered as the best practice to write your Rails applications. Now, the next tip is try to write dry code to reduce the chances of bugs and maintenance overhead. Dry means do not repeat yourself. It means that you must have only one appearance of a code in your application. For example, you are using a method which is uh, required at multiple places to be invoked. For example, whenever a user gets created, whenever a article or any resource has been created, you need to send an email to admin, or you need to write a function to check for admin user that this user has been created, or article has been created, or some or any resource has been created. Then that method is responsible to check something and send straight to the admin user. But what happen if you will write that method at multiple places? Like for example, for all resources you have you have written that method individually or separately. Then if you have to make any change at one place, then you have to make that change for all the places. In that case, what will happen that you need to remember that at how many places you have used that common piece of code. Okay. Or that method, how at how many places you have used. So that requires some memorability from your side, and that will cause some maintenance, and it is not easier to remember everything and go there and change into the method. But if you write dry code, then it will be easier to remember that what has been changed and what you need to change. And it is also helpful in debugging, because if you have single appearance of code, then you have a single place where you need to go and fix that bug if there is any. And you don't have to remember multiple places, and you don't have to memorize files that where you have used that particular code. And it is also reduce the maintenance overhead. Why? Because single appearance required single maintenance, multiple appearance required multiple maintenance of the code. So try to write dry code as much as possible. Although writing dry code at everywhere is seems not easy and seems not efficient with the time, because sometimes it is required to deliver the code as soon as possible. But with the time you can try to manage your piece of chunks as a dry code, and then uh, identify them that where you have written that code, and just make them into some concern classes or some helper classes, or add some modules, and then you can use those particular piece of code into other files where you need that. So always try to write dry code. The ninth tips: write better test coverage to test your features. Although this is not necessary, but this is an optional tips that if you can write test coverage for every feature that you have implemented. Okay, no matter you are using the Rails mini test framework or you are using the RSpec, but if you can write test coverage for all the features you are implementing a Rails application, that would be better. But this is not required. Why it is not required? Because writing test coverage for any feature depends totally upon the client. Because writing test coverage for all the features increase the development cost. So it depends upon the client whether they need that or not. If they require that, then we need to write test coverage. If they do not require, then we can avoid that. But yeah, you must have idea about writing test coverage for whatever you are implementing on your models, controllers, and views. Okay. The tenth tips: that always use symbols as hash keys instead of strings. Why? Because strings are mutable and symbols are immutable. Whenever you write a string, no matter whether it is same or unique, whether it is unique or different, it always generates a separate object ID, and it always take place every time in the memory, but select generate a unique object id, and whenever you call that symbol generate a unique object id, and whenever you call that symbol it will use that particular id. So using symbols as hash key is better than using string. The tips number 11: if required, properly namespace your controller. It depends upon the requirement. For example, consider application where you require some controllers which should be namespace like admin. For example, user controllers inside the admin name with the admin prefix, articles controller with admin prefix, or something like that. Then in that case, you must namespace your controller, and just create admin folder inside your controllers, and then put all the required or all such controllers which requires admin prefix before access into that admin namespace folder. Okay, that will lead better programming practice. The 12th tips, though it is not necessary, but it is good if we can follow that properly comment if method or logic is complex, but avoid unnecessary comments. Okay, what I mean here is that if you have write any method or any logic in your controller file or model file or helper or concern or anywhere in your rails application or in any ruby file, then you must properly comment that particular feature. Okay, but avoid unnecessary comments. It means if your programming practice or writing comments or formulas, writing way of your formulas or methods are good enough to explain that what you are trying to do there, then do not write unnecessary comment for such methods or for such code snippets or code chunks. Why? Because unnecessary comments leads to very poor programming standards. Why? Because it does not make sense to write comment for every line of code. Okay, instead you must write comment only it is required, or only when it is required to uh, display required to show that what you are exactly trying to do here. Or you can use comments are when you are leaving a particular implementation into some intermediate phase, or you want to make some to do over the time, so in that case you can follow comments there, or you can write comments there. So these are 12 very basic but very important tips and tricks that you can follow or you can apply while developing a Rails application. And this is just what I do when I write Rails application. There might be some other tips and tricks that you follow. So I would like to tell you that if you find this video very helpful or useful, then share with others. And if you follow other practices, whatever I mentioned in this video, then please let me know as well. I will try to adopt them as well. And if possible, I will prepare a video on that as well. Okay, so thanks for watching this, and let's meet in the next lecture with another important topic. Till then, tata. Thank you.